Okay, once again, a little video here. This one will be on the science of systematics. And if you would prefer PDF, there's a PDF on Carmen. It has the text boxes, which is kind of summarizing the video here. All right, systematics is actually a very large science, and it's a science that looks at all of the differences in plants, animals too, but for our purposes, plants. The study of plant diversification. In other words, how and when and where did plants, the species of plants, become the species of plants that they are? How did these little changes over time give us the species that we have today, and when did those changes happen? It is a very broad field that involves the field of taxonomy, which we've already discussed, the science of sorting things into groups, the science of phylogenetics, which looks at how relationships between different plants and different species formed, and the science of biosystematics, which looks at when those relationships formed. So we've talked about taxonomy, in other words, the who is this organism. I show you a picture of a plant and you say that is a red maple. I show you a picture of an animal and you say that is a lion. I show you a picture of a different maple and you go that is a Norway maple. So identifying things and giving that thing a name. That's a little bit different from phylogenetics, which is the development of groups of plants. This is looking at to see if you can determine which group might be older than another group. In other words, it arose evolutionarily in an earlier time frame. I'll show you a chart later so you can see how complicated this can get. But what we're looking at is when plants diverged and became different species, or which ones are older than other species, which ones might be younger or newer species. So that's a different type of science. And then finally we have biosystematics, which is looking at the process of evolution and what caused this genetic variability. It looks to know what happened, how a species actually showed up on the planet. Did the plants land on some island because birds arose there with seeds? Did a mountain range split up a continent and thus plants had different environments on either side of the mountains? Did some random mutation happen in their genetics or some chance hybridization that normally wouldn't have taken place? This looks at genes and how those genes change over time and how plants adapt to different areas over time. So here's an example. We take a look at this picture. The science of taxonomy is going to ask, who is this plant? And it's done when we give that plant a name, both a scientific name, a common name. We fit it into that hierarchy that I showed you earlier, the species, the genus, the family, etc., etc. Phylogeny is going to ask, who else is related to this plant? What other plants have characteristics similar to this? And do those plants have ancestors in common? And then biosystematics is going to get even larger and say, how, when, and where did this plant become a species? So each science within the large science of systematics asks a slightly different question for how this plant got here. The ultimate goal of systematics would be to inventory the entire Earth's biota. That's a large number of organisms. The Earth's biota, that's going to mean every living creature on the planet. It's a really lofty goal. We know life on this planet is very, very diverse. But understanding that can definitely help identify useful plants, can help us understand the history of plants. Maybe can look at, hey, we know this plant arose under these conditions, so if we want to save that plant, we have to give it those conditions. Ask yourself why temperate regions would be mostly complete, and tropical regions, we really have no idea how complete they are. Some of them maybe only 30% complete. Some of them may be 70% incomplete. It's tough to know because we don't know exactly how diverse some of these tropical regions are. So it's basically trying to use all of the information to gather as much information about every single organism we have on this planet. Let's look at a couple of examples. You don't have to write any of this down. It's not going to be on a test or anything like this. But take a close look at this typical pea flower. And you can see the drawing might make it look a little bit more clear than the photograph of the yellow flower. But all things in the Fabaceae, or the bean or pea family, have things in common. So when we look at other plants that have this flower, we might say to ourselves, oh, they don't look like they have anything in common, but their flowers look very, very similar. So we want to look for similarities. So if we take a look at this pink flower, this happens to be from a tree called a redbud. But if you look very, very closely at the flowers, you can actually see this plant has all the same flower parts that any other plant in the pea flowers. Look closely. You see they look like pea flowers, even though this is a tree and not a green bean or a bean. This one might be a little bit more familiar to some of you. This is a soybean. So soybeans and the tree redbud are actually closely related, even though they don't appear to have much in common at first. Think of a soybean or a green bean fruit. Knowing what that fruit looks like, can you make a guess as to what redbud fruit looks like also? You probably can. We can do this with lots and lots of different families. Here's another family, the Asteraceae, or the daisy family. It's probably a family of flowers that you're fairly familiar with. If you've seen a sunflower, you've seen a daisy, right? So it's a very common flower shape. This works for a lot of plant families. So all daisies will have this very similar shape. If you aren't familiar with sunflowers, think of a dandelion. Dandelions are also in the daisy family. If you don't know this plant, can you make a guess as to what family is in? Are we in the Asteraceae family, or are we in the Fabaceae family? This plant happens to be the weed chicory, and it's in, as you can see, the Asteraceae family because it has little daisies for flowers. The Solanaceae family, or the nightshade family. The top flowers here are from potatoes. The bottom flowers, the yellow ones, are from tomatoes. Can you tell they're related? They're actually so closely related you can graft a tomato top onto a potato bottom. That's how closely related they are. But look how similar their flowers are. Now, here's another plant in the same group. It's a little bit harder to see the relationships between them, but if you look in the center of the flower, you will actually see that very, very similar organization of the reproductive parts, even though the petals look vastly differently in this case. More recently, I would say probably in the last 30 to 50 years, we've started looking at systematics based on compounds and enzymes and the chemistry within the plants. So things in the eucalyptus family have a scent or various oils in them. Things in the mint family have the scent and oils again. We often use them for cooking. Things in the rose family might have these antioxidants. In the mustard family, we have these, again, very strong scents, anti-cancer properties and things like that. So we're able to actually look at the chemistry of the plants and see if there are relationships there and not just based on physical characteristics. But in the last few years, we're really looking at genetics. And genetics will hopefully once and for all classify who's related to whom and be able to create molecular maps of similarities. And this has now become the basis for renaming and reclassifying plants. So in a lot of cases, we have plants that look very similar on the outside, so we thought they had to be related. We look at the genetics and you say, oh, one has a chromosome count of 11 and this one has a chromosome count of 16. So they're not really that closely related. So we're looking at genetics more and more for dealing with changes in plants. Don't write this down. What we're looking at here is a phylogenetic map, right? Don't worry about how they're created. Don't worry about memorizing this. Don't worry about understanding any of the words. What I want you to look at is we really talked about things in the Solanaceae family, or that nightshade family. This plant right here is a pepper. This plant right here is a tobacco. This plant right here is another form of tobacco. So if we take a look, you can see here, this line right here shows that these tobacco are fairly closely related. We come back a little bit further, and we see that peppers and tobaccos at some point in time had a common ancestor. You go back a little bit further, and you see petunia, which is also in that same family, and those are the flowers I showed earlier, also had a relationship, but that tobacco is closer related to each other than they are to petunias, which makes sense. We go back even further, and we can see that there was a common ancestor between all of these things in the Solanaceae family and lettuce. You go back even further, and you'll find lots and lots of relationships in things. So this is trying to determine the relationships. Notice it doesn't tell you when those common ancestors were. We're just trying to figure out where, at some point in time, was the common ancestor. So, how does this relate to agriculture? It seems like it probably doesn't at first, but the reality is there have been many, many points in time when it has helped agriculture. So let's take a look at the fungus Rhizoctonia. Scientists used to think that all Rhizoctonia fungi were the same species and all of them were bad. But we pulled in some systematicists and they did some genetic studies, and we learned that some are pathogens and some are symbiotic and some are even pathogens of other fungi. So by identifying them further, we could elucidate more about their usage and their function in the ecosystem. All right, smut is a nasty disease. The example I'm going to be using is from wheat. It's actually a disease from several other crop plants as well. And many years ago, a shipment of wheat went into Canada, and it was found to be infested with smut. So Canada wanted to ban all U.S. wheat. And of course, U.S. wanted to retaliate against that. But rather than simply leaving it up to politicians, they called in a systematicist, and through genetics determined that the species of smut that was on this particular crop of wheat, this container of wheat, was actually only found on rice. And how did that happen? Well, because what was in the container before? Rice. So that smut had absolutely nothing to do with the wheat and presented no danger at all to the Canadian wheat crop. Crisis averted. It's taught us that trees often harbor pathogens, even if those pathogens don't actually cause any symptoms. So one study was looking at different fungi in white cedar, and it found more than 50 different species of fungi living within the plant, only 9 of which were actually known at the time. Another similar study conducted by different researchers on different grouping of white cedar found another different 31 fungi, only 3 of which were known at the time. So within 2 different researchers, using 2 different populations of the same species, found 81 different fungi, only 11 of which were known at the time. So it's important to understand that these are things that can be helpful to us. So from a what do I need to know perspective, what is the definition, right? What are we trying to do with this particular science? What are some of the goals? And how can systematics relate to things that we are doing? This is a science that appears very technical, and it appears unrelated to agriculture and horticulture, but it can actually be beneficial to growers at all levels. All right, as always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to get in touch.